Hi everybody, TJ Mac Vintage Cards and Nostalgia here, and in today's video I'm going to be talking about the 1961 Fleer and Top sets, and these issues combine the AFL and the NFL cards. So in 1960 the American Football League started, and Fleer had the exclusive rights in 1960 to make the AFL cards, and Topps did the NFL that year. But in 1961 both companies combined the AFL and NFL leagues into their one issue for the year. So you're going to see some AFL and NFL cards in both the Topps and Fleer sets from that year. And this was the only time that occurred until 1968 when Topps took over the rights to the AFL and NFL again. And then the leagues merged starting in the 1970 season. But after 1961, Fleer did exclusively the AFL cards in 1962 and 1963, and then Topps took over the AFL cards from 64 to 67. And the NFL cards were done by Topps in 1962 and 1963, and then Philadelphia Chewing Gum had the NFL rights from 64 to 67. A lot of great sets during that period. In fact, I like them all just because I'm an avid football collector, and I just love capturing the history through football, through my cards. So I'm just a big-time football collector in addition to baseball and hockey. But the 1961 Topps set included the NFL Players in Series 1, which was cards 1 through 132, and the AFL Players in Series 2, which was cards 133 through 198. Now, from what I've read, the Series 2 cards are actually easier to find in high grade than the Series 1. Now, the 1961 Fleer took the same approach as Topps. They just had a few more cards in their set. The first series cards of 1 through 132 contain the NFL teams, and the second series cards of 133 through 220 contain players from the AFL teams. And similar to the Topps, the second series cards are easier to find than the first series cards, and they generally sell for less based on my research. So what I like about these two issues is there's a very different approach to design here. You can see that in the Topps issue, they went with the color backgrounds. You got the red and the green here, and the Bobby Mitchell and Jim Otto. And then with the Fleer, they went with game day shots of players that are typically on the sidelines or just warming up in the field. They're mostly pose shots in the set. In fact, I believe they're all pose shots in the set, but there's just different camera perspectives that you see, and they capture some really nice images of the fields behind the player. So here would be a shot of Johnny Unitas in the 61 before a game, and I believe this would have been on the Colts home field. He's wearing his blue jersey. And then here you can see the Colts logo, which was different than what they had done on the Topps cards, where there are no logos. They just state the team name and position. Now, I like both the 61 Fleer and Topps sets. I have more of the Topps cards. I've been working on adding more of the Fleer cards. I just picked up this Johnny Unitas recently, and this completed my Unitas run now of the basic issues from 1957 to 1974. I'd already had the Topps from this year. Now I got both the Topps and the Fleer, so I'm happy to have that now in my collection. But here you see Bobby Mitchell, who was one of the great all-around players from the 1950s into the 60s. Started out his career as a halfback, converted over later to a wide receiver. As the passing game became more proficient, you would see some of these athletes that were running backs transition into the passing game. I know Charlie Taylor did that, who's a Hall of Famer. He started out with the Redskins. He was a running back, and then he converted over. Some guys came out of college, like Tommy McDonald, who I'm going to show later, and he became a wide receiver in the NFL as well. So you'd see some of these guys that had that ability to catch the ball and great speed make that conversion to that position as it, again, became more proficient in the 1960s and onward. But love both of these issues, and again, I'm just going to continue to add more of them to my collection. But I want to talk a little bit about, before I get into the season, just how the football cards population is compared to baseball. So with Topps and Fleer, you had in the Topps issue 35,026 cards graded by PSA. There's 198 cards in the set, so that's 177 PSA cards per player. So just remember that number. And the Fleer have 26,510 in a 210 card set, and that's 120 PSA cards per player. So you have 177 in the top set on average per player and 120 on average in the Fleer football set. So the Fleer are a little harder to find already graded than the tops are. And then if you compared it to baseball, though, there's 364,230 graded baseball cards. The set's 589 cards, the 61 top set. So that's 618 cards per player. So if you go to Fleer in football, you have 120 PSA graded cards, 177 in tops, and then 618 in baseball. So now I'm showing you this 61 Fleer Johnny Unitas. Now I paid about $97 for this card with shipping and tax to my house. I won it in auction for $89, but when you added the shipping and the tax, it came to $97. So there are 460 Johnny Unitas cards graded, 79 in PSA 6, which I'm showing here, and that was the price I paid. Now let's compare him to some of the baseball players. Mickey Mantle, 9,372 Mantles were graded. 1,708 are PSA 6. They average $550 to $1,300, depending on how high-end that card is for the grade. Hank Aaron, 3,760 cards graded, 689 PSA 6, $250 to $475 it averages in a grade 6. Or ranges, not averages, but ranges. And then Willie Mays, 6,008 cards graded, 1,475 PSA 6, and the range is $160 to $375 for that card. So you can see that the Unitas card is not worth nearly as much as a Mantle or an Aaron or Mays, but Unitas was a key player from that era. I mean, he was the greatest quarterback of his time, and arguably the greatest quarterback ever. Again, it's hard to compare eras, but certainly what he did in his era made him stand out. 3 MVPs and won a couple championships as well, and a Super Bowl later on. So with that, I just wanted to show that difference there. And it's not so much that the Unitas is undervalued. The value is what it is. I just think that he's underappreciated, certainly, because football is generally underappreciated when compared to baseball. So I just wanted to show that off. Now, 1961 was an important year in NFL history because we saw the rise of the Packers dynasty as they won their first of 5 NFL championships under the legendary Vince Lombardi. Now, Bart Starr led the Packers over Y.A. Tittle's Giants 37-0 that year. Now, Tittle was like Jim Kelly and Fran Tarkenton of his day. He was an exceptional quarterback, but he just could not win the big game. As the Giants had lost 3 NFL championships in a row from 1961 to 1963, and Tittle was the quarterback. Now, the Packers had a do-it-all running back who was also the team's kicker, and Paul Hornung. And Hornung was the NFL's MVP in 1961 after scoring a league-high 146 points. Because you got to remember, he was a kicker as well as a running back at that time. And as Green Bay ready to face the New York Giants in the NFL championship game, Hornung was called to duty by the Army. So it appeared that Hornung wasn't going to play in the NFL championship against the Giants. And as the story goes, Packers head coach Vince Lombardi called President John F. Kennedy and asked that Hornung be granted leave for the title game. And amazingly, Kennedy obliged. Here's what Kennedy said: "Paul Hornung isn't going to win the war on Sunday, but the football fans of this country deserve the 2 best teams on the field that day." Hornung ended up scoring a rushing touchdown, making 3 field goals and 4 extra points. He had 19 of the Packers' 37 points that day. Here are the 3 passing yardage leaders from 1961. You got Sonny Jurgensen. And Jurgensen doesn't have a 61 Fleer card. He's only in the top set. And he had 3,723 yards leading the NFL that year, 14-game season at the time, 32 touchdowns, and he had an 88.1 quarterback rating, which was 3rd in the NFL. So he led the league in touchdowns and passing yards. Unitas was 2nd with 2,990 yards. He only had 16 touchdowns, though, and his passer rating was 66.1, which was 12th in the league. In the NFL today, he'd lose his job with that kind of a passer rating. Very different game back then, though, with passing coverage and how the passing game was utilized. Then you had John Brody. This is his rookie card. I've shown this one before. He had 2,588 yards, 14 touchdowns, and 84.7 passer rating, which was 5th in the league. I'm just going to flip a card over here so you can see what the backs look like. They have these really nice blue backs. And you can, it's got to make a photo there where you could take a stamp and place it inside the, I'm sorry, these ones were coin rub-off. You can use a coin over the blank space there on the back. Some of them were stamp backs, but not in 61. And you can see the previous year statistics there. Gotta love the colors on these cards. Here's the three of the great running backs from 1961. You got Jim Brown, who led the NFL in rushing with 1,408 yards. He also had 8 touchdowns, and he was a first-team All-Pro that year. And in the middle, you got Jim Taylor. Now, this is not his rookie card. His rookie card is actually 59 tops, but that is not Jim Taylor on his 59 or his 1960 tops cards. It's another Jim Taylor that played for the Cardinals. Doesn't look anything like this Jim Taylor. So some would argue that this might be his rookie card because it's the first one that actually pictures Jim Taylor on it, the Packers Jim Taylor. And this year he was second in the NFL in rushing with 1,307 yards, and he was first with 15 touchdowns, and he finished second in the MVP voting that year as well. Brown and Taylor were the only two runners to have over 1,000 yards. The next on the list would have been, I believe, in 700 or 800 yards, pretty far down the list from these two great running backs. But you did have Lenny Moore, who was a nice dual threat running back. He could catch the ball and also run very well with it. He had a combined 1,376 rushing and receiving yards that year with 15 total touchdowns, which was second in the NFL. He was a first-team All-Pro as well, and he averaged 7 yards per rush. Fantastic running back of that era. Just love these three cards together. You can see there in the back of the Jim Brown that it's slightly rubbed. You can see the player image starting to come through. I don't believe it impacts the grade unless it scratches or damages the card, which on those Jim Brown, it, of course, did not. Beautiful example of the Browns' great running back. Here are three of the great NFL receivers from 1961. You got Tommy McDonald, Dell Shoffner, and Raymond Berry. And this McDonald card is just a very unique perspective here, the way his head's positioned and the angle of the camera. I just love this card. I love the Eagles logo. And McDonald was a small receiver. I think he was like 5'8", but he was something else. Just a great all-around player, tough player. I'm going to talk more about him. He was the last player in the NFL that wasn't a kicker to play without a face mask. Played his entire career till 1968 without a face mask, and he was one of the smallest players on the field. Hall of Fame wide receiver. Love having him in my collection. There's only 89 of this card graded by PSA. I don't think it's a particularly rare card, but that's a pretty low pop count. And I think there's only 16 PSA 7s out there. Just a wonderful card to have. He led the NFL in 1961 in receiving yards with 1,144 and touchdowns with 13. And he was fourth in catches with 64. Here's the back of that card, just so you can see what the Fleer cards look like. Like a green back there with the white, the off-white. In the center here, you have Dell Shoffner, who's one of my favorite players from that era. And it's a shame that he's not a semifinalist for the Hall of Fame again this year. He was a 5-time first-team All-Pro. Didn't have a super long career, but he was an all-NFL first-teamer at wide receiver in the 1960s and is not in the Hall of Fame. He has 68 catches that year, which was third in the NFL. He was second in yards with 1,125 and fourth in touchdowns with 11. Now, if you were a kid in New York, you would have been disappointed in 1961 to see that he's still on the Rams in this card, because he actually played for the Giants in 1961 and was catching passes from the great Y.A. Tittle. And then on the end here, you got Raymond Berry, who was second in the NFL in catches with 75. He only had 873 yards receiving, which was 10th in the NFL. And he did not catch a touchdown in 1961, which is surprising, considering Johnny Unitas was his quarterback. And here's his 1961 Fleer card to go with it. Here we have three of the great defensive players of that era. Here's the 1961 Gino Marchetti, Sam Huff. Love that Sam Huff card and that stance. I just picked this one up recently. And I also have his Topps card as well, as you can see right here. But that Fleer one really stands out. Giants didn't wear the red jerseys. They wore them in the 50s into the early 60s, but they didn't wear them much after that. So it's cool to see him in his red jersey there. And just got to love that old school Giants logo on the card. And then you have the Hank Jordan, or Henry Jordan rookie with the Green Bay Packers. He was not in the Fleer set, but he is in the Topps issue. Now, Jordan was a defensive tackle with the Packers. He won 5 straight first-team All-Pro honors from 1960 to 1964. Just a great defensive tackle from his era. And Sam Huff was maybe the finest middle linebacker of his time. He was the first middle linebacker, thanks to Tom Landry, who was the defensive coordinator of the Giants in the 1950s, to be featured in the 4-3 defense in a prominent role of stopping the runner. And he gained a lot of notoriety as that in that role. And he was the first defensive player to ever appear on Time magazine in 1959. Did not make very much money that year, maybe $20-something thousand, and he was actually bagging groceries at a store in the off season. So he would be your bagger in the grocery line when you were checking out. Can you imagine an MVP caliber player doing that in this day and age? Just shows you how much times were different. And in the case of Gino Marchetti, here's his Fleer card as well. And he was a defensive end. He was a 7-time first-team All-Pro, including 6 in a row from 1957 to 1962. And in a 14-game season of 1961, he had 13 sacks. Just a fantastic all-around defensive end. He could stop the run. He was great on the pass. Just somebody that you didn't want to upset. He was that kind of a player. I'm still working on getting some more of the AFL cards to add to my collection, but I'm going to show off some of the ones that I have here. Not all of them, but just a few of them today. So here you see, I think, 3 of the best receivers in the AFL at that time. And Art Powell, who just was announced as a semifinalist for the Hall of Fame. I'm thrilled to hear that. I don't think he's going to get in, but I'm just happy to at least hear the recognizing a guy that played exclusively in the AFL on the Hall of Fame ballot for this year for football. Just thrilled to see that. He's actually wearing his Eagles jersey there because a lot of these guys came from NFL jobs into the AFL. And you can see the same here with Don Maynard in the center there. He was a NFL and AFL player, and this is him in his Giants jersey, but he's on the New York Titans, as you can see there on the bottom of the card. And Maynard was a Hall of Fame receiver. He would go on to star some in the NFL after the AFL and NFL merged. He caught passes from Joe Namath. And then at the end here, you have Lionel Taylor, who's wearing a very early Broncos jersey, which was one of the uglier jerseys they said at the time. But looking at it now, I just love the look of that jersey on this card with the green background. And he was the first professional player to have 100 receptions in a season in any league. And he led the league in receptions 5 times in 6 seasons from 1960 to 1965. And when he retired, he was second all-time with 567 receptions behind only Raymond Berry. Another player that should receive some Hall of Fame consideration, in my opinion. And we got to remember that the AFL stats count in NFL history because it was part of the league merger, is that being they were adopted by the NFL, the statistics of the AFL factor in to the overall NFL statistics. And that's an important point to make. Here we have the 61 Topps card of George Blanda and Jack Kemp. Blanda here is playing for the Oilers, which wore powder blue jerseys, but he's got his old Bears jersey on there, as you can see. And then Kemp was playing with the Chargers here, and that is the Chargers jersey. So Blanda led the Oilers to a championship in 1961 in the AFL. He was the league MVP with 3,330 yards. Kemp was second in passing yards with 2,686. Now, Blanda had retired from the Bears in 1959 because they had Eddie Brown at quarterback, and he didn't want to be just a kicker on the team, so he decided to retire. Then he joined the AFL in 1960, and his time in the league, coupled with his incredible longevity playing from 1949 to 1975 as a quarterback and a kicker, really cemented his legacy as a Hall of Famer, in my opinion. And just a great AFL player for sure. And next to Jack Kemp is Paul Lowe, and you can see him here wearing a 49ers jersey. It's not a Chargers jersey, even though he's on the Chargers on the card. It's because he played with the 49ers prior to coming over to the Chargers. And that's not the number he played with. That's number 37. He wasn't number 37 in the AFL. And I'm just going to show a couple other cards before I wrap it up here. There's a 61 Fleer Ollie Matson, who was coming towards the end of his career. He was a great dual threat running back as well. And the Chicago Cardinals traded him to the Rams for 11 players at one time. And I think that was in 1958 or 59 that occurred. None of the players were very good from what I understand, but just goes to show you how well thought of Ollie Matson was as a player. And then you have the great Bobby Lane there as well. I thought I would show that one at the end. One of my favorite players from the period. And like Tommy McDonald, he never wore a face mask in his career all the way to the end. And he would even wear pads that you wouldn't really see on a quarterback because he wanted the ability to be able to move around. And was just that kind of player. Tough guy. And he played from the late 40s all the way into the early 1960s. And just one of those guys that I enjoy. So that's it for today. I wanted to again share my 61 Topps and Fleer cards and just talk a little bit about football in general. What I showed you in those population reports pretty much hold true pretty much in the 50s all the way up until I'm sure into the 80s with football. It's just not as graded as frequently as baseball is. Even though I will say after the Super Bowl era began, football rookies really started catching up to baseball, where some of them are actually worth more than the baseball contemporaries that they played alongside. But when you get into the 50s and early 60s, there's really no comparison in pricing between baseball and football rookies. Again, not undervalued. The value is what the value is, but I think they're underappreciated, and I just love having football cards in my collection because there's just something special about football. You don't necessarily compare statistics in football. You have to really analyze and really understand the players and their impacts on the game, and I just love that about the sport, is the ability to think and use my imagination some. And there's a romanticism to football too in that era that I think doesn't always translate with those who are into statistics. So that's all I have for today. I hope you have a great weekend, and we'll talk again soon.